Hello and welcome to This Date in History, aka TDH, your daily source of interesting and important events I consider enough to be worth sharing. Of course, there are far more events that have happened, and I encourage you to seek them out as well, for everything and everyone matters. It is all connected. Today is Freya's Day, aka Friday, June 18th, 2021. The music you are hearing in the background is Memory by Electronomia and Rudd. A link to that, as well as other sources of videos and articles, are in the video description. Anyway, on with the show! In 1294, the first definitively known meeting of the Parliament of Ireland occurred at Castle Dermont in County Kildare. This government body was modelled akin to the Parliament of England, eventually to contain two chambers in 1537, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Living from the times of the Lordship of Ireland to the age of the Kingdom of Ireland, this governmental form lasted until 1800. In 1429, turning the tide of the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc led French forces to victory, defeating the main English army commanded by Sir John Fastolf during the Battle of Patay. Taking place in north-central France, this lawyer campaign engagement resulted in 100 dead or wounded on the French side, whereas England suffered 2,500 casualties, including captured forces. Going forward a couple hundred years, in 1778, British troops abandoned Philadelphia during the American Revolution. Having captured the city on September 26, 1777, from General George Washington after the battles of Brandywine and Clouds, the evacuation order was given to 15,000 Brits by General William Howe. In total, they had held the area for nearly 9 months. In yet another engagement of American versus British forces in 1812, the War of 1812 officially began when United States President James Madison declared war upon the United Kingdom. This conflict would last until February 1815 and was host to one of the most significant events to ever befall my nation, the invasion of Washington, D.C. and the burning down of the Capitol. 3 years later, in 1815, the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher defeated Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo. This ending to the Napoleonic Wars caused the self-proclaimed French Emperor to abdicate his throne for the second and last time, ultimately to be banished to Elba. In 1858, Charles Darwin was prompted to publish his theory on evolution after receiving a paper from Alfred Russel Wallace, in which it included nearly identical conclusions about evolution as Darwin's own. This new aspect of science almost instantly received backlash, mainly from creationism-believing religious folk, and would spark pop culture things like Pokemon. In 1873, after attempting to vote in the 1872 U.S. presidential election, Susan B. Anthony was fined $100. Susan would go down as one of the heroes of the women's suffrage movement in the States, abdicating for the right to females to vote. In more modern times, her actions are now celebrated in the form of her own coin, which is ironic to be part of an economy that was used to punish her. Moving on up to the next century, in 1900, in China, all foreigners, including alien diplomats and their families, were ordered to be murdered by Empress Dowager Cixi. In a move very par for the course of this country, the 65-year-old leader had already created a toxic environment of anti-Western hate. And by the time of this absolutely disgusting order, there was already a full-fledged war on anyone not native to China. 8 years later, in 1908, arriving in Santos, Brazil, aboard the ship Kasato Maru, 781 Japanese immigrants became the first of their people to arrive in the South American country. Today, there are over 2 million Brazilians of Japanese descent, over 56,000 of them having been born in the Empire of the Rising Sun. This makes Brazil the second largest country home to the Japanese, with the first obviously being Japan. 20 years later, in 1928, pilot Wilmer Stoltz and mechanic Lou Gordon flew Amelia Earhart over the Atlantic Ocean, making her the first female to make this crossing in an aircraft. Although not the actual pilot, this would not be her only notable aviation contribution. Ultimately, for her to vanish without a trace during her attempt to circumnavigate the globe on July 2nd, 1937. 20 more years later, in 1928, during a public demonstration at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, Columbia Records introduced the long-playing record album. With 23 minutes of recording surface per side, and the possibility of extending the time by lowering the signal level, this new format paved the way for future developments, like the 8-track, cassette, and CDs. Also in 1948, the Deutschmark was announced to be introduced in Western Germany and West Berlin by Britain, France, and the United States. In response, the Soviets increased restricting access to their side of Berlin over the course of 6 days. This currency would live past the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, lasting until it was replaced by the euro in 2002 when Germany joined the European Union. In 1953, Egypt became a republic with the overthrow of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, bringing an end to the Egyptian Revolution, which had started in 1952. The former dynasty, which had reigned since 1805, changed its ruling title on average every 30 years, and had also occupied land in Sudan and South Sudan. Today, Egypt is home to over 100 million people, the majority of which speak Arabic and are Muslim. With a history extending far beyond the time of recording, it is one of the few areas on Earth still hiding the very origins of our species. In 1981, the first operational aircraft initially designed around stealth technology, the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, made its first flight. This single-seat, twin-engine fighter came out of Groom Lake, Nevada, and it would take another 2 years before it achieved initial operating capacity status. Eventually retiring as a design in 1992, the craft paved the way for things like the SR-71 and extended other avenues of research, creating things like stealth boats. And in 2007, 9 firefighters died while fighting the Charleston Sofa Superstore in Charleston, South Carolina. The fire is believed to have spread in a pile of discarded furniture in the loading dock area, and although the ignition source is still a mystery, it is believed a carelessly tossed cigarette may be the catalyst. Eventually, the structure would collapse, but not after a battle that lasted about 1/3 of a day. Births: Roger Ebert, 1942, Barbara Broccoli, 1960, Alex Hirsch, 1985. Deaths: Ronald Amdustin, 1928. And that concludes today's episode. Once again, I encourage you to invest more time in history. You never know what may have happened in the past unless you find it yourself. Until tomorrow, be safe and keep an open mind!